What do you do when your wife tells a full room, with a smile, that her ex will always stay in her life, and every fork stops moving because they are waiting for you to explode, until you choose one dark truth that makes the whole table go silent? My name is Grant Hale, and I learned the hard way that family dinners are not meals. They are trials where everyone pretends they are not judging you. That night, the house smelled like roasted meat and sweet wine, and the air carried the warm, sticky comfort people use to hide sharp questions. Walter, my wife's father, liked to host because hosting let him control the rhythm, the seating, the tone, and the story of who belonged. He was a broad man with a laugh that filled space like furniture, and he treated kindness the way some men treat money, as something you dispense only when it buys obedience. I walked in with a bottle he would approve of, smiled the right amount, and listened to the small talk the way a person listens to weather reports before a storm. There was nothing wrong yet, which is what made it feel wrong, because the wrongness had already been scheduled. Elara was already there, glowing with that practiced ease she used when she wanted a room to love her. She kissed my cheek, held my gaze for a fraction too long, and then moved away like she had to prove she was not nervous. The table was set with heavy plates, real napkins, and a centerpiece that looked like it had been arranged by a committee, which told me Walter had decided this dinner mattered. Tessa, Elara's sister, was perched near the kitchen entry like she was running logistics, and Dean, her husband, hovered at the edge of conversations like a man trying to be invisible while still being present. Mara, the so-called neutral voice of reason in their family, stood by the drink station with a soft smile that never reached her eyes because she liked to watch before she spoke. I sat where Walter directed me, which happened to be at the far end, close enough to be included, far enough to be contained. Elara sat opposite me, angled slightly toward her father, as if his approval mattered more than my comfort. I noticed the small details because I always notice them, and I noticed that her phone was face down, close to her plate, like a secret under her palm. When a person wants you to trust them, they do not hide their phone like contraband. When a person wants to win, they treat the phone like a weapon and the screen like the muzzle. The first 20 minutes were a parade of safe subjects, work updates, neighborhood gossip, the usual social glue people spread on cracks. Walter asked me about my job with a tone that implied he was the one who hired me, and I gave him a short answer that left no room for his opinion. Tessa laughed at nothing and kept glancing at Elara like they shared a private channel. Dean caught my eye once, then looked away, because he was the type of man who could sense conflict early and still convince himself it would pass without touching him. Mara made her rounds, refilling glasses, smoothing edges, keeping herself positioned like a referee who refuses to admit the game has started. Then the plates arrived, and with them the silence that comes right before someone pulls a pin. The clink of forks began, and for a moment it looked like a normal family. Elara smiled, dabbed her mouth, and let her gaze drift across the table, collecting attention the way a performer collects applause. I watched her the way you watch a person at the edge of a pool right before they jump, because the jump is not the point, the splash is. Elara set her fork down carefully, as if she wanted the sound to be heard, and she announced, in a voice that carried without shouting, that her ex would always be part of her life. She said it as if it was mature, reasonable, even noble, like she was gifting everyone a lesson in modern love. Walter's eyebrows lifted in approval, because he loved anything that sounded like control. Tessa leaned forward slightly, like she had been waiting for that line. Dean froze with his fork halfway to his mouth. Mara's expression stayed soft, but her eyes sharpened, because she understood what a public declaration meant inside a marriage. I did not react, and that was the first betrayal, not hers, mine, because I refused to give her the scene she wanted. If I flinched, if I raised my voice, if I asked who, why, when, the whole table would shift into sympathy mode for Elara, the brave woman trapped with a jealous man. They would remember my tone, not her words. They would talk about my anger, not her loyalty to another man. So I chewed slowly, swallowed, and lifted my glass as if I was considering the wine. I let the quiet settle, and I watched the room fill the silence with their own expectations. Walter cleared his throat, ready to steer the moment into his preferred shape, but Elara kept going because she felt powerful. She said her ex was family, that their history mattered, that adult people do not erase each other, and the speech had that polished, familiar cadence of something rehearsed. When someone is speaking from their heart, they stumble on a word, they pause, they search. When someone is speaking from a script, they hit every beat like a drummer. Tessa nodded along at the exact right times, and it made my skin itch because it looked less like support and more like a performance review. Dean tried to laugh it off, made a weak comment about everyone having baggage, and Walter laughed in the big way he used when he wanted to signal the room to relax. Mara watched me, waiting for the snap. Elara watched me, waiting for the snap. Even the chairs seemed to wait. I set my glass down and looked at Elara with a calm that felt almost unfair. I did not ask her to explain. I did not ask her to choose. I did not insult her ex, because insulting him would give him weight. I just let a small pause stretch long enough to make people uncomfortable, and then I said one dark psychological truth, the kind you do not say unless you are ready for the room to change temperature. I told them in plain words that the person who demands an audience for their loyalty is usually hiding a betrayal they want normalized. I told them that declaring a third person inside a marriage is not honesty, it is a test, a way to see who will tolerate disrespect so the disrespect can grow. I told them that when someone builds a public shield first, it is because they plan to do something that will require it. I did not accuse Elara of an affair, because accusations are weak without proof. I did not name her ex, because naming him would make him real in that room. I simply described the mechanism, the pattern, the psychology of it, like I was explaining a trick I had seen too many times. The table went dead silent, and it was not the polite silence people use to show respect. It was the kind of silence that happens when everyone realizes the air has teeth. Forks stopped moving. Glasses hovered midair. Dean lowered his hand slowly, like he feared making noise. Walter stared at me as if he had just discovered a crack in his own authority. Tessa's smile slipped for half a second, and in that half second, I saw anger, not surprise. Mara's eyes flickered down to the table, then back up, because she understood the difference between an emotional outburst and a controlled statement of reality. Elara's face changed in a way she could not control. First, there was disbelief, because she expected me to be the simple villain. Then there was calculation, as she tried to decide whether crying would work. Then there was resentment, because I had stolen her stage without raising my voice. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out at first, because my words were not an argument she could debate. They were a mirror, and mirrors do not negotiate. Walter recovered first, because men like him always recover first. He demanded to know what I meant, demanded to know why I was speaking like that in his home, demanded to know why I was making dinner uncomfortable. The question was not about my meaning, it was about his control. I told him calmly that dinner was already uncomfortable, and I was simply refusing to pretend it was not. I told him that if his home required me to accept public disrespect, then his home was not a place for marriage, it was a place for theater. Tessa tried to rescue Elara by calling my words cold, by implying I was overthinking, by asking why I could not just be flexible. I told her flexibility is what you ask for when you want someone to bend until they break. Dean stared at his plate because he knew someone was lying, but he did not know who, and he hated being forced to choose. Mara finally spoke, soft and measured, and suggested everyone take a breath because she could feel the heat rising. Elara found her voice again and tried to laugh, the bright little laugh she used to disarm conflict. She said I was dramatic, that I was reading too much into one sentence, that she was just being honest. I nodded once, not agreeing, not rejecting, just acknowledging her attempt. Then I said I loved honesty, and I looked forward to seeing it in action. The sentence sounded gentle, but it landed like a warning because I did not say it like a man begging for truth. I said it like a man who already had a plan. Dinner continued after that, but it was a corpse of a dinner, a thing that moved only because social rules demanded it. Walter spoke more than necessary, trying to patch the atmosphere with volume. Tessa kept glancing at Elara, whispering tiny comments, rehearsing recovery. Dean drank too much water, because he needed something to do with his hands. Mara watched everyone, the way you watch a room after a glass breaks, to see who steps on the shards first. Elara did not look at me again until we stood to leave. In the hallway by the coat rack, where no one else could hear clearly, she asked why I would embarrass her. She said it as if she was the injured party, as if she had not declared another man's place in our life like a banner. I told her I did not embarrass her. I described a pattern, and if the pattern fit, that was not my fault. She leaned closer, eyes shiny, voice low, and she said we would talk at home. I nodded because nodding costs nothing, and I let her believe she still had control. In the car, the streetlights slid across her face like stripes. She stared out the window for most of the drive, then turned suddenly and asked if I was accusing her of cheating. I kept my eyes on the road and told her I was accusing her of disrespect, and I was documenting the rest. She asked what documenting meant, and I said it meant I was done living inside vague stories. She scoffed, tried to make me sound paranoid, and when that failed, she tried softness, telling me she loved me and wanted peace. Her tactics changed faster than the traffic lights, and each change told me she was not speaking from truth. She was speaking from strategy. At home, she went straight to the kitchen and began cleaning, wiping surfaces that were already clean, making movement so she would not have to sit with the silence. I watched her for a minute and realized something ugly and useful at the same time. Elara did not fear my anger. She feared my calm. Anger is a storm you can ride out. Calm is a door closing. I went to the bedroom, opened the drawer where we kept spare paper and old bills, and I pulled out a simple notebook that had been sitting unused for years. I wrote the date at the top of the page and the title of the event in plain words, because plain words hold up better than poetic ones. Then I wrote one sentence about what she had said at the table, one sentence about how I responded, and one sentence about how the room reacted. I signed it and put the notebook back. It was not proof of an affair. It was proof of a public boundary being violated, and proof begins with boundaries. Elara came into the room and asked what I was doing. I told her I was keeping track of important moments. She rolled her eyes and said I was acting like a lawyer. I told her I was acting like a husband who had finally learned that memories can be rewritten, but ink resists. She told me her ex was not a threat, that I was insecure, that Walter thought I was being controlling. I let her speak, because the more she spoke, the more she revealed the direction of her defenses. She did not say, "I am sorry for hurting you." She said, "Other people agree you are the problem." Before bed, her phone buzzed, and she flipped it face down so quickly it looked like reflex. She caught me seeing it and said it was just Tessa checking in. I nodded, and I did not ask to see it, because demanding a screen turns you into a caricature. Instead, I turned off the light, lay on my back, and listened to her breathing shift into the shallow pattern of someone who is pretending to sleep while their mind runs. I stared at the ceiling and understood the real lesson of the dinner. Elara had moved the battle into the open because she believed an open room was safer than a private one. She was wrong, because an open room is only safe if you control the record. Morning arrived with the tired gray color of unfinished conflict. Elara acted like nothing happened, moving through the apartment with the cheerful efficiency of someone trying to overwrite the night with routine. She made coffee, offered me a mug like a peace treaty, and asked if I wanted to go to Walter's again next weekend, as if last night was simply a weird joke that would fade if we pretended hard enough. I took the coffee, because refusing coffee becomes a symbol, and I did not want symbols. I wanted facts. I told her I had work plans next weekend, and I watched her eyes narrow for half a second before she forced them open again. After she left for her day, I sat at the kitchen table and opened the notebook. I drew a simple 5-column table, the kind you could explain to a child. Date, time, claim, observed reality, proof. I did not fill in much yet because rushing creates messy work. The point was not to build a giant case overnight. The point was to build something that could not be dismissed as a feeling. I also made a rule for myself that morning, and I wrote it at the top in block letters. No private confrontation without documentation. Private confrontation is where people lie best, because there are no witnesses and no records. It becomes your word against theirs, and the best liar always wins that fight. I had no interest in losing a fight I did not need to have. The first thing I checked was the shared calendar, because calendars reveal what people wish they could forget. We used it for normal things, doctor appointments, family events, birthdays, errands, the harmless scaffolding of a life. I did not need to hack anything. I did not need to sneak. The calendar was shared by design, and if Elara wanted privacy, she should not have built her excuses on shared structures. I scanned the week and found a conflict that should not exist, 2 commitments stacked on top of each other with clean, bland titles that sounded normal. One was marked as a family obligation at Walter's. The other was marked as a planning meeting for a volunteer committee. An odd choice because Elara had never volunteered for anything without making sure someone saw her doing it. I exported the week view as a PDF, saved it, and printed it, because digital proof is easy to delete and hard proof is harder to argue with. I wrote the date on the back and signed it, not because a signature makes it legally magic, but because signing is a signal to myself that I am not guessing anymore. I placed it in a clear sleeve from an old folder I used for household documents, and the sleeve made it look official in a way that embarrassed me a little. Then I reminded myself that embarrassment was a luxury I could not afford. Later that afternoon, my phone buzzed with a merchant alert from my bank, the kind of notification I had turned on years ago because I liked knowing where my money went. The alert showed a charge that was not huge, but it was precise enough to matter. A payment at a cafe I never visited, a place that was not on Elara's usual route. It might have been innocent. It might have been a mistake. It might have been a friend. The problem was not the amount. The problem was the pattern, and patterns are built from small, repeated choices. I took a screenshot of the alert with the time visible and added it to the sleeve behind the calendar PDF. I wrote in the notebook, merchant alert, unfamiliar cafe, time matches volunteer slot. Then I did nothing else with it, because people expect a husband to sprint toward the first clue, like a dog chasing a thrown stick. I was not sprinting anymore. I was building a slow collapse. That evening, Elara returned home with a brightness that felt glued on. She asked about my day with the sweetness of someone performing concern. I answered with the exact level of detail that gave her nothing to manipulate. She talked about hers in broad strokes, using smooth phrases like productive, busy, hectic. When I asked a simple follow-up question about the volunteer committee, she hesitated, then said it was just planning for an upcoming community event. She added that she had been invited because people trusted her. She did not say who invited her, and she did not say where they met, because details are where lies bleed. I nodded and said it sounded nice. She looked relieved because she expected me to push. She expected me to demand names. She expected me to act like the jealous husband at Walter's table. Instead, I asked if she had the schedule for the event because I wanted to support her. She smiled too quickly and said she would send it later. That was the second time she promised later for something that should have been immediate, and my notebook caught it like a net. The next day, I stayed alert for what I could observe without becoming a stalker. Household-level proof does not require spying. It requires patience and attention to what people give away while they are busy pretending. Elara's phone lit up on the counter while she was in the shower, and the screen displayed a lock screen preview, just a line of text, just a fragment of meaning. I did not pick up the phone. I did not open anything. I simply read what the screen offered in plain sight, the way anyone could. The message was short, but the tone was intimate, casual in a way that suggested repetition, and it referenced last night as if last night belonged to them. My mouth went dry, and for a second I felt the primitive urge to storm into the bathroom and demand answers. Then I remembered my rule and let the urge pass like a wave. When Elara came out, wrapped in a towel, she saw my face and asked what was wrong. I said nothing was wrong and asked if she had slept well. She laughed, said she slept fine, and her eyes darted toward her phone like a nervous tick. She picked it up and turned it face down again, like a ritual. At work that afternoon, I received a message from Dean, and it was so unusual that I read it twice. Dean was not the type to step into conflict unless it was already on fire. He asked if I was okay after the dinner and said things felt tense. I responded politely and asked what he meant by tense. He replied that Walter had been complaining about my attitude, and Tessa had been saying I was trying to isolate Elara. There it was, the frame being built around me, the patient construction of a story where my calm was not maturity, but control. I thanked Dean for the heads up and asked one question that mattered. Had Elara mentioned where she was going this weekend, specifically? Dean said she mentioned a committee meeting and used the exact same phrasing she used with me, as if it was branded. I wrote that down and circled it, because when two people repeat the same phrase, someone taught it to them. That night, Elara told me she had to attend a brief planning session, and she said she would be home early. She dressed carefully for something she called brief, and she wore the kind of perfume she saved for public settings. I asked where the meeting was, in a tone that suggested pure logistics. She said it was near the community center. I nodded and told her to drive safe. Her eyebrows lifted slightly because she expected resistance. She kissed my cheek and left, and the kiss felt like a checkmark on a list. I waited 10 minutes, not because I wanted to follow her, but because I wanted to see if she would return for something she forgot. People lying often forget small items because their minds are busy juggling bigger ones. She did return, rushed, and she grabbed a small clutch from the hallway shelf that she rarely used. As she grabbed it, a folded piece of paper slipped out and fluttered to the floor. She froze, then scooped it up quickly, but not quickly enough for me to see the top line. It looked like a printed program or an event insert, not a volunteer agenda. She tucked it away and smiled too brightly, as if smiling could erase what gravity had shown me for free. After she left again, I went to the shelf and checked the spot where the paper had been, and I found nothing, because she was careful. Still, the moment mattered, because it proved she carried printed material she did not want me to see. I opened the notebook and wrote, "Printed insert, folded, guarded, not volunteer-looking." Then I sat back and let the anger settle into something colder, because anger is loud and temporary, but coldness is disciplined. When Elara came home late, she told me traffic was bad, then told me the meeting ran long, then told me someone needed a ride, and she delivered the 3 explanations as if she was testing which one I would accept. I did not pick one. I simply asked what time the meeting ended. She gave a time. Then, without emotion, I asked what time she had left the community center. She gave a different time that did not align, and her eyes narrowed as she realized she had stepped into a trap made of simple questions. She corrected herself quickly, laughed, and said she was exhausted and mixing things up. I nodded and said, "Exhaustion does that." Then, I asked if she could add the next meeting to our shared calendar so I could plan dinner. She agreed, too fast, because agreement buys time. Later, when she was asleep, her phone buzzed again, and she rolled over and grabbed it like a reflex. She did not answer in front of me, but the way she held it under the blanket, the way the screen glow pulsed against the fabric, told me enough. I stared at the ceiling and understood the real enemy was not simply Nolan, the ex she had announced like a trophy. The real enemy was the story being built around me, the story where I would become the problem even if she betrayed me. I got out of bed quietly, went to the kitchen, and opened the sleeve folder. I laid out the printed calendar, PDF, and the merchant alert screenshot, and I wrote a new line in the notebook. The record has started, and it will not stop. Then I returned to bed and listened to Elara breathe, steady and untroubled, because she still believed she could talk her way out of anything. I turned my head toward her in the dark and made myself one promise that felt brutal, but necessary. I would not win this by catching her in a dramatic moment. I would win it by letting her keep talking until her own words destroyed her. And I knew the next family dinner would not be a meal. It would be a courtroom without robes, and I would arrive with documents instead of anger. The next week moved like a slow machine, and every day felt like it had been designed to test my patience and reward my restraint. Elara became unusually generous with affection in the hours that mattered, which was how I knew she was trying to buy something without saying the price. She brought me coffee in the morning, touched my shoulder when she walked behind my chair, asked if I wanted my favorite dinner, and then slid the same rehearsed phrases into the air about being busy and being needed. She did not understand that tenderness, when timed like a bribe, stops feeling like love and starts feeling like pressure. I kept my voice steady, my schedule normal, and my attention sharpened. I was not looking for a dramatic catch, because dramatic catches always come with dramatic excuses, and I had no interest in hearing a performance. I was looking for repeatable facts, the kind that look boring until you stack them, and then suddenly they look like an unbreakable story. On Wednesday, a small envelope appeared in our mail slot with Elara's name printed neatly on the front. I did not open it, because I did not need to turn myself into the villain in my own home. I left it on the console table where she could not miss it. When she came in, she picked it up too quickly, and the motion had that protective edge I had seen when the folded paper slipped from her clutch. She tried to look casual while reading it, but her eyes moved fast, and her mouth tightened at the corners like she was doing math in her head. I asked what it was, in the same tone I used when I asked about weather. She said it was just an update for the committee event she had mentioned, and she said it with a smile that felt more like a lock than a welcome. I nodded and told her I was glad she was enjoying it. She looked relieved, which was the only honest reaction she gave me that day, and she tucked the envelope into her bag like it was a passport. That night, while she was in the shower, I stood in the hallway and watched the bathroom light glow under the door. I did not listen. I did not press my ear to the wood. I simply waited, because waiting is not spying, and patience is the cleanest weapon. When she came out, she left her bag on the kitchen chair while she went to the bedroom to change. The envelope corner was visible, sticking out just enough to be careless. I did not take it. I did not remove it. I took a photo of the visible corner with the date and time on my own screen reflected faintly in the shot. Then I set my phone down and walked away. It was not much, just a partial view of a letterhead with a name that mattered. The header read, Hawthorne Family Trust, and beneath it, in smaller font, an event title that turned my stomach with its neat civility. Community Benefit Dinner. Sponsor Circle Briefing. It was not a volunteer committee. It was a donor event. The kind of event where people trade smiles for influence and pretend it is charity. Elara returned to the kitchen, saw her bag, and slid it under her arm. She asked if I wanted to go out this weekend, and her tone was too bright, too eager, like she was trying to place me somewhere far from the truth. I told her we could, depending on her schedule. She hesitated, then said the event was Saturday, but it would be short. I nodded and asked where it was held. She said a private hall near the Arts District, and she added quickly that it was not a big deal. That quick addition was the tell, because people do not label things unimportant unless they fear you might label them important. On Thursday, my bank alert chimed again, and this time the merchant was not a cafe. It was a florist. The charge was small enough to be dismissed, but it carried a location that did not fit our life. Elara did not buy flowers spontaneously. Elara bought flowers when she needed an image, and she bought them in places where someone would see her holding them. I stared at the notification for a long time, then took the screenshot and wrote the line in the notebook, because the notebook did not care about my feelings. It only cared about what happened. On Friday evening, Elara mentioned Nolan again, but she did it softly, like she was trying to slip him into the room without triggering a fight. She said he might be at the benefit dinner because he still supported the trust, and she said it like she was announcing weather. She added that it would be awkward if I showed up, because people would misunderstand. I looked at her and asked who exactly would misunderstand. She blinked, then said, people in general, donors, organizers, old friends. She did not say what they would misunderstand because the truth was obvious enough to make her careful. I told her I had no intention of embarrassing her in public. She relaxed, as if she had just disarmed a bomb. Then I told her I also had no intention of being managed like a risk. Her eyes narrowed slightly, and she asked what that meant. I said it meant she could invite me like a wife invites a husband, or she could stop calling it our marriage and call it what she was treating it like, which was a public relations project. Her face flushed, and she accused me of being cold again. I nodded, because cold is what you call a person who refuses to play your emotional games. Saturday morning arrived with a forced calm that felt staged. Elara dressed for the event with a precision that was almost ceremonial, the kind of dress that looks effortless while requiring effort, the kind of makeup that looks natural while being calculated. She checked her phone twice before leaving, and she kept her smile anchored on her face, like a pin holding something back. I asked what time the sponsor briefing started, because I wanted to plan dinner. She gave me a time without looking me in the eye. After she left, the apartment felt quiet in a way that made every small sound louder. I sat at the table, opened the sleeve folder, and arranged the calendar printout, the merchant alerts, and the photo of the letterhead corner. I did not have a confession, and I did not have a photo of her in someone else's arms, and I did not need it yet. I had something stronger, which was the slow exposure of lies that were already cracking. When a person lies about the setting, they usually lie about the person. When a person lies about the person, they usually lie about the reason. I was building a ladder to the top of that structure, one rung at a time. Around midday, my phone buzzed with a message from Mara. She asked if I was coming to the benefit dinner. I stared at the screen until the words started to look like shapes instead of letters. Elara told me it would be awkward if I showed up, and now Mara was asking as if my attendance was expected. I replied politely and asked why she thought I would be coming. Mara responded that Walter assumed I would come, because the trust likes to present families, and he did not want people asking questions. There it was, the first clean proof of manipulation that did not come from my own suspicion. Elara had been shaping the story in two directions at once, telling me not to attend while letting her father believe I would be there. That meant she wanted the option to claim surprise either way, depending on which version served her best. I wrote it down immediately, and I underlined the word option, because option is what liars build for themselves. I did not rush to the venue. I did not send angry messages. I simply stayed home because staying home gave her no reaction to feed on. When she came back that evening, she arrived later than she claimed she would, and her hair had that slightly undone look that happens when someone has been touched or rushed. She walked in fast, eyes wide, and said the event was a mess. She said there were too many people, too many questions, too much awkwardness. She said Nolan was there, and she said she barely spoke to him. She said she was exhausted and needed a shower. I watched her and said I was sorry the night was stressful. She blinked at me because she expected anger. Then she asked if I had heard anything from her family. I asked why I would have. She hesitated, then said Walter had been asking about me, and it made her uncomfortable. I asked what she told him. She said she told him I had work. I nodded and asked why she had not told me he expected my presence. She snapped that she did not want drama. She said she was trying to protect us. She said the word protect like it was a shield, but it sounded like a cage. I told her I appreciated protection when it was mutual and transparent. I told her I did not appreciate being treated like a liability. She stared at me for a long moment, then said I was being unfair. She went to the bathroom, and she shut the door with more force than necessary. While she showered, her phone lit up on the counter again, and the lock screen preview displayed a name I had not seen before. The message fragment was short and casual, and it referenced a ride in a hallway. I felt my pulse thicken, but I kept my hands still. I did not touch her phone. I did not open anything. I simply noted the exact time in my notebook, because time is one of the few things liars cannot argue with forever. When she came out, she took her phone immediately and scrolled with her thumb fast, as if she was cleaning a spill. She looked at me and asked why I was staring. I told her I was thinking. She asked what I was thinking about. I told her I was thinking about options, and how many options she seemed to need for someone who claimed she had nothing to hide. Her face hardened, and she told me I was ruining our marriage with suspicion. She told me I was becoming obsessive. She told me my calm was a mask for control. I listened and nodded once, because that was her tactic now, to paint me as unstable before my proof became public. People who plan to betray you do not only betray you, they build a story where you deserve it. Before bed, I checked the shared calendar again, and I saw something that made my stomach drop. The benefit dinner did not appear on the calendar anymore. It had been there earlier in the week. Now it was gone, as if it never existed. She had removed it, and she had removed it after the event, which meant she did not remove it to avoid clutter. She removed it to erase the trail. I exported the current week view as a PDF, printed it, and placed it beside the earlier printout in the sleeve, because the absence was as meaningful as a presence. Then I wrote a single sentence in the notebook that felt like a turning point. She is editing the record now, which means she fears the record. When I lay down beside her, she turned her back to me, and the space between us felt wider than the bed. I stared into the dark and understood something that made my jaw tighten. The dinner at Walter's was not the beginning. It was the announcement. Elara had been preparing the room to accept Nolan's presence, and now she was cleaning the trail behind her like a person who expects an inspection. And inspections were exactly what I planned to deliver. On Monday, the pressure arrived from a direction I did not expect, and that was how I knew the story had started spreading without my permission. I walked into a local cafe near my office, a place I used because it was quiet and predictable, and the barista greeted me with a sympathetic look that did not belong to coffee. She asked how I was doing, and she said it in that careful tone people use when they already heard something. I thanked her, paid, and sat in a corner seat where I could see the door. 2 minutes later, a man from our neighborhood walked in, spotted me, and hesitated. His name was Clint, and he was the type who loved being the first to know things. He walked over, lowered his voice, and asked if everything was okay at home. The question was too loaded to be casual. I asked what he meant. Clint said he heard things were tense between me and Elara, and he said he hoped it would not get ugly. I asked who told him that. He looked uncomfortable, then said, "People talk," and he left it vague like a coward. I smiled politely and told him I appreciated his concern. He nodded, relieved, because he expected me to snap. He wanted the story to become true in real time. When I did not give it to him, he looked almost disappointed, like a man who bought tickets to a fight and got a lecture instead. After he left, I wrote one line in my notebook. Neighborhood gossip wave initiated, source unknown, timing post-benefit. It was not proof of cheating, but it was proof of a smear arc starting. That evening, Mara called and asked if I could stop by her place later in the week. She said she wanted to talk privately, and her voice carried that careful balance between loyalty and fear. I agreed because refusing would look like avoidance, and I did not want to look like anything. I wanted to be factual. At home, Elara acted even sweeter than before, and sweetness under pressure always signals fear. She made dinner, asked about my day, laughed at my small jokes, and then, when she thought I was softened, she mentioned Nolan again like a casual footnote. She said he had offered to help with something related to the trust, and she said it would be good for her to stay on good terms with him because he could open doors. She used the phrase open doors, and it landed with a blunt honesty she did not intend. It was not about closure. It was about leverage. I asked what doors. She said professional ones, networking ones, donor connections, and she said it fast, as if speed could turn ambition into innocence. I nodded and asked a simple question that made her blink. I asked whether she was married to me or to the doors. She stared for a moment, then laughed sharply and said, I was twisting everything. She said Nolan was just part of her life, and she was not going to apologize for having a past. I told her she did not need to apologize for a past. I told her she needed to stop importing that past into our present like it was furniture. She left the table, took her phone, and disappeared into the bedroom. A minute later, I heard her voice, low and urgent, not loud enough to catch words clearly, but sharp enough to recognize the shape of secrecy. I did not press my ear to the door. I did not record. I simply noted the time and wrote, urgent call after door question, pattern, retreat to phone after pressure. The next day, I did something that felt small and almost pathetic, but it mattered because it stayed clean. I went through our household drawer where we kept old receipts, random coupons, and warranty papers. I did not dig through her private things. I did not open her bag. I looked through the shared chaos that belonged to both of us. And that is where liars often slip, because they forget that shared spaces keep shared secrets. In the mess, I found a folded valet ticket with a date that matched the benefit dinner. The ticket had a timestamp and a location name, and it was not the venue she described. It was a boutique hotel 2 blocks away. My mouth went dry, but my hands stayed steady. I photographed the ticket beside today's newspaper because date alignment is everything, and I put it into a sleeve. Then I wrote the line in the notebook. Valet ticket, benefit night, hotel location, time window overlaps her claimed departure. That night, Elara came home with a bright scarf she had not owned before. She draped it over a chair and went to the kitchen. The scarf smelled faintly of cologne, not mine, and the scent was clean and expensive. I did not mention it. Mentioning it would give her a chance to manufacture a story. I simply waited. 2 days later, I visited Mara. She lived in a small house with a tidy yard and furniture chosen for comfort rather than status, which made her feel more honest than the rest of them by default. She offered me tea, sat across from me, and asked if Elara had been acting strange. I told her Elara had been acting strategic. Mara frowned, like she was trying to choose between loyalty and reality. Then she said she heard something at the benefit dinner that bothered her, something she did not know how to tell me. Mara explained that Nolan was not just present. He was treated like he belonged. She said a few donors greeted him warmly, and she said someone called him by a title that implied he had influence in the trust. She said Elara stayed close to him more than she should have, and she said she saw them leave the main hall together for a stretch of time. She could not say what happened. She could only say it looked coordinated, not accidental. I thanked her and asked one precise question. Did she see anyone else with them? Anyone who might have a reason to cover for them? Mara hesitated, then said Tessa had been hovering nearby all night, like she was running interference. That name landed heavy because Tessa was the one who nodded too perfectly at Walter's table, the one who pushed the controlling husband narrative, the one who managed Elara's image like it was a brand. I drove home with my hands tight on the wheel and a strange clarity settling in. Nolan might be part of the story, but Tessa was shaping it. Elara might be the face, but someone else was directing the camera. At home, I opened the sleeve folder and laid out the pieces. Calendar printouts that showed the event, then its deletion. Merchant alerts that showed the cafe and the florist. The partial letterhead photo that linked her to the trust. The valet ticket that placed her at a hotel near the venue. Mara's account, which I wrote down as a neutral witness line with date and context. It was not sensational, but it was coherent, and coherence is what breaks liars. Elara arrived while I was putting everything away, and she stopped in the doorway, eyes narrowing as she noticed the clear sleeves on the table. She asked what I was doing. I told her I was organizing household documents. She stepped closer, scanning the table, and her breath changed when she recognized the valet ticket. Her hand twitched toward it, then stopped. She tried to smile, but her mouth did not obey. She asked why I had that. I told her it was in our shared drawer. She said it must be old. I asked her whether she wanted to say that on record, meaning in the notebook, with a date. She stared at me like I had slapped her without touching her. Then she accused me of setting traps. I told her I was not setting traps. I told her she was stepping into them because she kept lying about simple things. I told her I did not need to guess what she did behind a hotel lobby door. I only needed to prove she was not where she claimed to be when she claimed it. Her face went pale, then flushed, then hardened, because the only thing worse than being accused is being cornered by paperwork. She told me I was humiliating her. She told me I was treating her like a criminal. She told me Nolan was part of her life, and I would not change that. She used the same sentence shape as the dinner announcement, and the repetition made my skin crawl. I asked her whether that sentence was hers, or whether someone coached her to say it until it sounded normal. She stared, and for a second I saw fear, not anger. Fear that I was seeing the script. She grabbed her phone and walked toward the bedroom, and I did not stop her. Stopping her would look like control. Instead, I sat down at the table, opened the notebook, and wrote one new line with calm precision. She recognized the valet ticket immediately, then tried to deny it. When she came back out, she looked composed again, but it was the composition of a person who had just made a call for help. She said she wanted space. She said she might stay with Tessa for a few nights, because she felt unsafe with my obsession. The word unsafe was deliberate. It was a seed planted for future use, the kind that grows into a story where I am the monster. I nodded once and told her she could go where she wanted. I told her I would not stop her. Then I added one sentence that shifted the room. I told her that if she left now, after being caught in a lie, she would be confirming what she was trying to hide, and I would treat it as the beginning of formal separation planning. She froze because she expected pleading, not boundaries. She asked if I was threatening her. I told her I was informing her. I told her she could either stay and tell the truth, or she could leave and let the documents speak for her. She stood there for a long moment, jaw tight, eyes glassy, hands shaking slightly at her sides. Then she turned away and went to pack a small bag without saying goodbye. When the door closed behind her, the apartment went quiet in a way that felt final. I sat at the table, stared at the sleeves, and realized the game had shifted. If she was willing to plant a narrative that I was unsafe, then the next move would not be private. The next move would be public, because public is where narratives live or die. And I knew exactly which room she would choose next, because she always chose rooms with witnesses. Elara slept somewhere else that night, and the apartment felt like a stage set after the actors leave. Every object looked identical, but the air had changed, like a room that has been used for an argument still holds the heat. I cleaned nothing, because cleaning would have been denial, and I was done performing comfort for someone who weaponized it. I sat at the kitchen table until the clock changed numbers twice, not because I needed rest, but because I needed to think in straight lines. In the morning, I found the first proof that she had already started framing me. It was not a confession, not a photograph, not a dramatic exchange. but it was the kind of public seed that grows into a story if you do not step on it early. A mutual friend had posted a vague message about controlling partners and emotional safety, and two of Elara's closest acquaintances had reacted within minutes. It was clean enough to deny, but coordinated enough to recognize. I did not engage, because engagement feeds the machine. I took a screenshot, saved the permalink, and wrote the time beside it, because the timing always tells you who is driving. By noon, the pressure tightened from another angle. Walter texted me, not to ask how I was, not to ask what happened, but to request I attend a trust meeting later in the week. He phrased it like an invitation, but it read like a directive. He said the family should present unity, and he implied that Elara's absence had created questions. I sat with that message for a long moment. Then I replied with polite neutrality and asked what the meeting concerned. Walter answered that it was a sponsor briefing and a governance update, and he added that Elara was overwhelmed and needed support. Support. The word people use when they want you to play a role in their story. Elara needed support, but I was not allowed to attend the event last weekend, and now I was expected to attend the governance meeting to show unity. The contradiction was not accidental. The contradiction was the structure. I called Mara and asked if she could forward me the public RSVP list for the next trust event, if it existed. I did not ask her to spy. I asked for something public because public documents do not require guilt. Mara agreed, and 30 minutes later, she sent a screenshot of a guest list page with names visible enough to be useful. The page was not secret, just selective, the kind of list that gets shared to the right people and then denied to the wrong ones. Nolan's name sat on it like a stain that had been scrubbed poorly. I printed the screenshot, signed the back with the date, and slipped it into a clear sleeve. Then I opened the notebook and wrote a simple line that calmed me more than any breathing exercise ever could. Public RSVP confirms Nolan invited as sponsor circle guest. It was dull, clean, and undeniable. That evening, I received a message from Elara. She said she needed time and space, and she asked that I not contact her family. She said I had scared her, and she said she did not know what I was capable of anymore. She did not accuse me directly of violence, because that would have been a risk, but she laid the path toward it with careful phrasing. I read the message twice, then I wrote down what mattered, which was not her emotion, but her intention. She was building a narrative that made me a threat, because a threatened wife becomes a protected wife, and protected wives get believed. I responded with one sentence, calm and sterile, like a note left on a hospital tray. I said I would respect her space, and I asked her to keep communication limited to practical matters. No apology, no pleading, no argument. If she wanted to paint me as unstable, I would give her the opposite. The next day, Clint cornered me again in the lobby of our building. He did not approach with curiosity this time. He approached with the kind of false concern that carries an appetite for drama. He asked if Elara was okay, and he hinted that he had heard she left because she felt unsafe. I looked at him, let the silence stretch, and then asked him where he heard that. He pretended not to remember. I asked him again, slower, and his eyes shifted toward the elevators like he wanted an exit. He mumbled something about Tessa checking in on people, making sure everyone was okay. There it was, a name tied to the smear, delivered by a man who loved gossip more than truth. I thanked him for his concern and walked away, because I did not need to win in the lobby. I needed to win in the room where the record mattered. On Thursday morning, Mara forwarded me a second item, and this one hit harder. She had received a group message from Tessa about an upcoming trust meeting, and the message included a subtle warning about sensitive family dynamics. Tessa wrote that the meeting should remain respectful, and she asked everyone to avoid fueling conflict, and she suggested that Elara had been under intense emotional pressure at home. Tessa never named me, because naming me would invite a response, but she drew my outline with practiced strokes. I printed the message thread and highlighted the line about pressure at home. Then I wrote a note under it with a black marker, not for drama, but for clarity. Pre-frame attempt, public sympathy build, weaponized ambiguity. When you name a tactic, you strip it of power. That afternoon, I made the next clean move in the only arena I could trust, which was civil process. I booked a consultation with a family mediator, not because I wanted to sprint to divorce, but because I wanted dates on paper that could not be rewritten later. I requested the appointment confirmation and saved it. I printed the receipt. I put the confirmation into a sleeve like it was a bullet in a magazine. People who pre-frame you as unstable hate paper trails, because paper does not care about vibes. In the days that followed, I slept poorly, ate mechanically, and kept my voice level in every conversation because I knew what was coming next. Elara would attempt to provoke a reaction that proved her story. Tessa would attempt to manufacture witnesses who felt noble while repeating half-truths. Walter would attempt to convert the trust into a courtroom where family loyalty mattered more than facts. I could either fall into it and become the villain, or I could let them exhaust themselves against silence and documents. On Saturday, the trust meeting arrived. It was scheduled at a private room attached to a charity venue downtown, the kind of space that smells like polished wood and expensive intentions. I dressed plainly and arrived early, not to intimidate, but to anchor the timeline. I did not bring a binder that screamed accusation. I brought a slim folder with a few clear sleeves, the kind of thing that looks like normal paperwork until you realize it is evidence. Elara arrived with Tessa. They entered together, not as friends, but as a pair, synchronized and ready. Elara looked thinner than before, and her eyes were bright in a way that suggested she had been rehearsing her emotions. Tessa looked composed, the kind of composed that reads like authority, even when it is just confidence. Nolan arrived minutes later, and he greeted Tessa first, not Elara. That detail was small, but it mattered, because it showed where the power truly sat. Walter opened the meeting with a short speech about family and community and the importance of legacy. I listened, nodded when polite, and let him believe I was cooperating, because cooperation lulls people into carelessness. When the governance update began, a board secretary passed out an agenda. I did not take notes on the agenda. I watched who looked at Nolan when certain items were mentioned, and I watched who avoided looking at Elara when her name surfaced as a potential liaison for sponsor relations. Halfway through, Tessa raised a point about conflict management, and she looked at me while saying it as if she was handing the room a pre-written story. She implied that recent tension had made it difficult for Elara to commit fully. She suggested Elara might need accommodations. She framed it as kindness, but it was a move to place Elara under her own control, because accommodation often means supervision. I did not react immediately. I let the room settle into its assumptions. Then I asked a single practical question about scheduling, the kind that sounds harmless until it forces accountability. I asked whether Elara's availability had been updated in the shared sponsor calendar because the last event had been removed from our shared week view afterward, and I wanted to ensure future commitments were handled properly. I did not accuse. I did not dramatize. I spoke like a man asking about a missing invoice. Elara stiffened. Tessa's smile tightened. Walter frowned as if he did not like the direction of the air. Tessa responded quickly and said, "Calendars get messy," and she suggested private conversations would be better. I nodded and agreed that private conversations were often better for feelings. Then I added calmly that calendars were better for facts. The room went quiet for a second, not dead silent, but attentive enough to make Elara's breathing audible. Nolan shifted in his seat, and I noticed his hands. He held them together like a man trying to look innocent while anticipating a storm. That was the moment it clicked for me, not as suspicion, but as pattern recognition. Nolan was nervous, but Tessa was not. Elara was frightened, but Tessa was controlled. Walter was irritated, but Tessa was pleased. This was not a lover's romance driving chaos. This was a manager's strategy driving a narrative. I looked at Nolan, then at Tessa, and then at Elara, and I understood the first major twist without anyone saying a word. Nolan was not the center of the plan. Nolan was the lever. Tessa was using him to reposition herself and control the trust's face, and Elara's marriage was simply collateral damage in her branding exercise. Elara's affair was real, but the purpose was not love. The purpose was alignment. The meeting ended with polite stiffness. People said goodbyes with forced warmth, and Walter told me he hoped I would be supportive during a difficult time. Elara avoided my eyes. Tessa looked directly at me and gave me a small smile that felt like a warning disguised as grace. Nolan left quickly, and he did not look back once. In the parking lot, Elara finally approached me, but she did it with Tessa within earshot. She said she needed me to stop making things harder, and she said I was embarrassing her. I kept my voice low and said I had asked only a scheduling question. She accused me of manipulation. I nodded and said, manipulation is when you force a person to choose between silence and shame. Her eyes widened because she recognized the phrasing, and she glanced at Tessa as if she wanted permission to respond. Tessa stepped in and suggested we all calm down, and she said she could help facilitate a respectful separation if needed. Respectful separation. A phrase meant to make her sound like a savior while she sharpened the knife behind her back. I thanked her for her offer and told her I had already booked a mediator appointment. Her face flickered, just once, with irritation. She had not expected me to move first in the only system she could not control with charisma. That night, I returned home and opened my folder. I added a new sleeve with one sentence written in marker at the top. Twist confirmed. Tessa steering, Nolan leveraged, Elara coached. I did not feel triumphant. I felt focused because I now knew who the real enemy was, and real enemies do not stop at rumors. The smear accelerated after the trust meeting, like a car gaining speed once it clears a curve. I did not have to guess. I watched the pattern unfold in real time because people who operate through social pressure always reuse the same channels. The neighborhood group chat filled with vague posts about boundaries and safety, and the comments grew bolder as more people sensed permission. A friend I barely trusted sent me a message asking if everything was okay, which is what people ask when they want to extract a confession without looking cruel. I answered no one except the people who mattered, and even then I stayed factual. Every time I wanted to lash out, I pictured Tessa's expression in the meeting, that controlled calm that depended on my reaction. She needed me to explode so she could label the explosion as proof. I refused her that. Elara sent another message midweek, this time more practical, asking about retrieving a few personal items. She said she would come by when I was not home, because she did not want conflict. She phrased it as self-protection, but it was also a way to keep me from watching what she took. I responded that she could come at a scheduled time, and that Mara could be present as a neutral witness if she preferred. I offered a witness because witnesses cut through narratives. Elara did not respond for hours. When she finally replied, she agreed to a scheduled pickup. She also added, quietly, that she did not want me recording her. That single line told me everything about her strategy. She was not worried about recordings. She was worried about a calm, consistent record. She was worried about me looking reasonable while she looked rehearsed. On Friday evening, Mara arrived at my apartment 15 minutes before Elara. Mara brought nothing dramatic, no clipboard, no badge, no role play. She brought her normal handbag and the same tired honesty she always carried. We sat at the kitchen table, and I placed a small stack of clear sleeves in front of me, not as a weapon, but as a reminder to myself. I was not here to punish. I was here to stop being rewritten. Elara arrived with Tessa. Of course she did. Elara could not face the consequences alone, and Tessa could not resist controlling the optics. They entered like they owned the hallway, like the building itself should acknowledge their narrative. Elara's eyes flicked to Mara, then to the sleeves on the table, and her shoulders tightened. Tessa stayed near the door and said she was only there to ensure things stayed calm. Mara looked at her and asked calmly why a friend needed to supervise a simple item pickup. Tessa smiled and said she wanted to be supportive. Support again. Always support. The word that hides control. Elara walked toward the bedroom to collect her items, and I did not follow. I stayed at the table, hands open, posture relaxed. Mara stayed seated. Tessa hovered, scanning the room like she was searching for something she could later claim to have seen. I let her scan. People who scan are usually the ones who plant. Elara returned with a small suitcase and a tote bag. She moved quickly, not looking at me. She asked if she could take a few things from the hallway closet. I said yes, and I said it like I was granting permission to breathe, because I wanted the room to hear my calm. She opened the closet, pulled out a garment bag, and then hesitated as her hand brushed the drawer where I had found the valet ticket earlier. Her fingers froze for a second. Then she shut the drawer too carefully. Mara saw it. I saw it. Tessa saw it too, and for a moment her face tightened with concern, not for Elara, but for herself. It was a strange reaction, and it made my stomach settle into a hard certainty. Tessa feared what that drawer represented. Tessa feared the evidence that did not require interpretation. Elara turned and said she wanted to leave. I nodded and said she could, and I added one sentence that mattered more than any argument. I said that if she intended to continue claiming she felt unsafe, then we should keep communication through the mediator and document everything cleanly, because safety claims deserve structure. The phrase safety claims landed in the room like a heavy object. Elara stopped. Tessa's smile faltered. Mara's eyes narrowed slightly because she understood what I was doing. I was not accusing Elara of lying. I was treating her narrative like it was serious enough to require official process. Liars hate that because it forces them to either retreat or commit. Tessa stepped forward and said we did not need to escalate. She said Elara just needed time, and she implied that my insistence on documentation was controlling. I looked at her and asked a question that sounded polite and cut deep. I asked whether she had advised Elara to use the word unsafe. Tessa blinked, then laughed lightly and denied it. The denial came too fast. The denial sounded rehearsed. Elara's eyes flicked to Tessa again, and in that flick, I saw something human and ugly. Elara was not only lying to me, she was leaning on Tessa's script to survive the consequences. She was letting another woman steer her marriage because it was easier than owning her own betrayal. After Elara left, Mara stayed behind. She told me, quietly, that Tessa had been calling people. Mara said Tessa had been shaping the story that Elara was emotionally fragile and that I was cold and unpredictable. Mara said Walter had been repeating the same phrasing as if he had received a memo. Mara also said something else that tightened my chest. She said Nolan had been telling people he was worried about Elara's safety too, and that he had heard I was the type to retaliate. Retaliate. That word is a trap. If I retaliated loudly, I confirmed it. If I retaliated silently, they would call it sinister. The only way out was to retaliate with facts in a room where facts mattered. The next morning, I received an email from the mediator confirming our appointment and outlining basic documentation expectations. I printed the email, put it in a sleeve, and wrote the date on the back. Then I drafted a short, neutral message to Elara through our agreed channel, stating the mediator time, requesting that both parties bring any relevant scheduling and financial documents, and asking that all claims be made clearly on record to avoid misunderstanding. I sent it without emotion, because emotion was the product Tessa wanted me to sell. Hours later, Elara replied with a new angle. She said she would attend, but she insisted Tessa be allowed to join for support. She framed it as necessary because she felt overwhelmed. I responded that the mediator would decide who could attend, and that it was common to keep sessions to the parties only. I did not say no. I said, process. That evening, I drove to the neighborhood where the charity venue hosted many of the trust's events. I did not go inside. I did not stalk doors. I simply parked across the street and watched people arrive for another small gathering, because I wanted to understand how Nolan and Tessa moved in public. After 20 minutes, I saw Nolan step out of a rideshare and enter the building. Minutes later, I saw Tessa arrive in her car and hand her keys to a valet. Then Elara arrived, and she did not enter immediately. She paused at the sidewalk, looked down at her phone, and then walked in with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing someone is waiting. I did not follow. I did not need to. I had already seen enough to confirm the structure. Elara was not trapped. Elara was choosing alignment. When I got home, I checked the shared cloud album that Elara and I still used for family photos. I did not hack it. I did not access anything private. I opened what I owned. A memory pop-up appeared at the top of the screen, showing a photo from last year, a group shot at a community event. The date was visible, the location tag was visible, and in the corner of the frame, barely noticeable unless you were looking for patterns, was Nolan, standing near Elara with his hand placed in a familiar way. It was not overt. It was not graphic. It was simply too intimate for two people who insisted they barely spoke. I took a screenshot of the memory pop-up with the date visible and saved it. Then I printed it, placed it into a sleeve, and wrote one line beneath it. Pattern predates recent conflict. Narrative of sudden stress is false. That was the second twist forming, and it hurt in a way I did not expect. I had assumed the affair was recent, sparked by the trust's events and the attention. The memory suggested it had roots, and deeper roots mean deeper lies. It also suggested something else, something darker in a psychological sense. Elara had not been pushed into betrayal by my coldness. She had been cultivating betrayal while smiling at family dinners, while letting Walter talk about legacy, while letting me believe we were building something together. When you realize someone has been lying for longer than you imagined, you stop asking why and start asking how far they have already gone. By Sunday night, Walter called me and asked that I come to a family dinner at his house again. He said he wanted to clear the air. He said the family needed unity. He did not mention that Elara would be there, but I knew she would, because Walter was allergic to uncertainty. I agreed, because refusal would be cast as guilt, and I was done giving them interpretive space. Before I went, I prepared my folder. I did not pack it like a weapon. I packed it like a calendar. A few sleeves, clean labels, nothing dramatic. I told myself, repeatedly, that the goal was not revenge. The goal was to stop being rewritten. At Walter's house, the dining room looked exactly as it always did, like wealth trying to appear tasteful by pretending it is humble. The lighting was warm, the food was arranged carefully, and the chairs felt expensive in a way that makes you sit straighter, even when you do not want to. Elara sat at the table already, and she looked exhausted, but her exhaustion read performative now, like an outfit she had learned to wear well. Nolan was not there, at least not at the table. Tessa was there, seated close enough to Elara to appear protective. Walter opened dinner with small talk, then shifted quickly into concern. He asked if I was willing to support Elara during a difficult adjustment. He asked if I was willing to be respectful. He asked if I was willing to avoid escalating. The questions were not questions. They were a script designed to place me on defense. Elara then announced calmly that Nolan would always be part of her life. She said it like a verdict, not like a confession. She said it like she was daring me to react in front of the people she needed as witnesses. I did not react. I did not interrupt. I did not raise my voice. I let her sentence settle into the room, because it sounded worse the longer it sat there. Walter watched me with narrowed eyes, as if he was waiting for the moment he could label. Tessa leaned slightly forward, as if she expected my anger to validate her narrative. Instead, I set my fork down and looked at Elara with the calm focus of a man describing a medical diagnosis. I told her that when someone insists an ex will always be part of their life, they are not talking about love or history. They are talking about control, because an always person is a permission slip to violate boundaries forever. I told her that the reason she needed an always person was not romance. It was that she could not stand being fully seen by one man, because being fully seen forces accountability. The table went quiet in the way rooms go quiet when someone says something true that no one wants to repeat. Walter's face tightened. Elara blinked rapidly. Tessa's expression hardened, because she knew I had changed the frame. I had not accused Elara of cheating at the table. I had diagnosed her need for ambiguity, and ambiguity was the engine of their whole plan. Walter demanded I explain myself. I asked whether he wanted emotion or facts. He said he wanted the truth. I nodded and said the truth was already in motion, and that the mediator session would put everything into a clean record within days. I told him I would not fight at his table, but I would also not be coached into silence by people who were building a story about me behind my back. Then I stood up, thanked him for dinner, and left without looking at Elara again. As I walked to my car, my phone buzzed with a notification from the mediator's office. The appointment time had been confirmed again, and the message included a reminder about documentation and respectful conduct. It felt like a quiet drumbeat behind my ribs. Elara thought she had just won a public moment by declaring Nolan permanent. What she had actually done was hand me a perfect line to file into the record. And records, unlike dinners, do not care who feels powerful at the table. The morning after the dinner, my apartment felt quieter than usual, like the walls were waiting for the next version of the story. I slept in short bursts, waking every time my mind tried to solve the same equation with different numbers. Elara had declared her ex permanent at her father's table, and she had done it with the confidence of someone who believed the room would protect her from consequences. I did not want to punish her, but I wanted the truth to stop being optional. At 10:30, I put on a plain jacket, checked that my folder was in my bag, and left with the calm posture of a man walking into a routine appointment. The folder was not dramatic. It held printed screenshots, message headers, dates, and a short ledger I had written in my own hand. I had learned long ago that the only way to survive a narrative attack is to stop talking in adjectives. The mediator's office was in a building with a lobby that smelled like coffee and carpet glue, the kind of place where people come to sign documents they promised each other they would never need. I arrived early because being early is a quiet way to control the clock. I sat in the waiting room and watched the door, not with paranoia, but with the patience of someone who knows the next play before it is called. Elara arrived 8 minutes late. Tessa arrived with her. They walked in together, Elara with a face that looked exhausted and practiced, Tessa with the polite authority of someone used to being believed. Elara's eyes met mine for a half second, then slid away as if eye contact would force her to feel something real. Tessa did not avoid my gaze. She held it, measured me, and gave a small smile that tried to make her presence seem normal. The receptionist called our names, and the mediator stepped into the waiting room. Her name was Dana, and she looked like someone who had heard every lie humans can invent to stay comfortable. Dana shook hands with each of us, then glanced at Tessa. Dana asked if Tessa was a party to the marriage. Tessa said she was only there for support. Dana nodded once and said, "Support people do not attend initial sessions unless both parties agree in writing." Tessa's smile held, but her eyes tightened. Elara opened her mouth to protest, then stopped when Dana held up a single finger and repeated the policy line, calm and final. Tessa stepped back and sat in the waiting room. Elara hesitated, as if she had forgotten how to stand without someone telling her what to do. Then she followed Dana down the hall. Dana's office was clean, neutral, and designed to drain drama from the air. 2 chairs on one side, 2 chairs on the other, a small table between us, and a box of tissues placed like a trap for people who preferred tears over truth. Dana sat with a notepad and an expression that suggested she could smell manipulation the way some people smell smoke. Dana explained basic rules, then asked why we were there. Elara began speaking first. She described tension, emotional pressure, and feeling unsafe. She did not say I hit her or threatened her directly, but she used language that leaned toward it, the kind that makes listeners fill in the worst version on their own. She said I was cold, unpredictable, and controlling. She said I made her feel watched, even though she had demanded I accept her ex as permanent. I listened without interrupting. I kept my hands visible. I kept my voice steady. Dana watched me as Elara spoke, and I could tell she was tracking my behavior as much as my words. Elara wanted me to react like a villain. I gave her a man who sounded tired and precise. When Dana asked me to respond, I did not start with feelings. I started with a timeline. I said I came home from a trip early and realized Elara was missing. I said she told me she was in our bed, and I had proof she was not. I said she arrived 20 minutes later panicking. I did not exaggerate. I did not dramatize. I told it like a police report, without the police. Elara's eyes flashed. She tried to interrupt, and Dana stopped her with a raised hand. Dana told Elara she would have time to respond after I finished. Elara leaned back as if she had never been told no before. I took my folder out and placed it on my lap, not on the table, because I did not want to look like I had come to perform. I said I did not want revenge. I said I wanted separation handled cleanly and safely, and I wanted claims of fear and control documented properly so nobody could twist them later. I watched Elara flinch at the word documented. Dana asked if I had evidence of infidelity. I said I had household-level evidence that supported contradictions, and I had reason to believe Elara had been coached into a narrative that framed me as dangerous. I said I did not have wiretaps, trackers, or anything illegal. I said I had dates, public lists, and normal receipts. Dana nodded and asked for 1 item, not 10. 1 item. That was the first sign she was serious. She did not want a spectacle. She wanted a cornerstone. I handed her a clear sleeve containing the public RSVP screenshot that showed Nolan's name connected to the trust event Elara claimed she never attended. I had signed the back with the date I printed it, and I had noted the time it was received. Dana studied it, then asked Elara whether Nolan had been invited. Elara said Nolan was invited because he supported the cause. Dana asked whether Elara had met Nolan in person. Elara said yes, but it was professional. Dana asked why Elara had told me she was elsewhere that evening, if Nolan was part of a public event she attended. Elara's mouth opened, then closed. She tried a new sentence, but it started with the same phrasing she used in her messages, a smooth set of words about needing space, not wanting conflict, feeling pressured. Dana leaned slightly forward. Dana asked Elara to answer one question, directly. Why did you tell your husband you were in your bed when you were not? Elara's cheeks flushed. Her eyes slid toward the door, toward the hallway, toward where Tessa was waiting. Then Elara said she panicked, and she said she was overwhelmed, and she said she did not want to fight. Dana wrote something down, then asked a second direct question. Dana asked whether Elara had described me as unsafe to others. Elara looked at me as if the question itself was an attack. Then she said yes, because she felt unsafe. Dana asked what made her feel unsafe specifically. Elara hesitated, then said my calmness scared her. She said my silence felt threatening. Dana nodded again, and I noticed the particular way she nodded, like she had heard that line before from someone who could not prove anything else. Dana asked whether Elara had ever reported any threats to any authority or any professional. Elara said no, because she did not want to escalate. Dana asked whether she was now escalating by spreading the impression anyway. Elara's jaw tightened. Dana then asked if I had any other evidence. I said yes, but I would keep it limited and relevant. I offered one more sleeve, a screenshot of the group message where Tessa framed Elara as under emotional pressure at home. I did not call it a smear. I called it pre-framing. Dana read it, then asked Elara why Tessa was speaking about Elara's home life to a group of people. Elara said Tessa was trying to help. Dana asked whether Elara had asked Tessa to help. Elara hesitated again. For the first time in the session, I saw something like fear in Elara's face, but not fear of me. It was fear of losing control of the story. When you build a narrative on mood and implication, a direct question is like bright light. Dana closed her notepad and leaned back. She said we were not there to litigate emotional impressions. She said we were there to make a safe civil plan. She said accusations without details would not help either of us, and she said both parties should keep communication factual and written. Then Dana said something that shifted the room. She said that if Elara truly felt unsafe, she should consider seeking formal protections through appropriate channels, and she should not rely on social storytelling for safety. The sentence was calm, but it was a boundary. It forced Elara to either retreat from the claim or commit to it with consequence. Elara's eyes filled, and for a second I almost felt sympathy. Not because she was innocent, but because I recognized the panic of someone whose script has stopped working. She pressed her lips together, then said she wanted a structured separation without public humiliation. The phrase public humiliation was not accidental. It was the exact fear beneath everything. She could handle losing me. She could not handle losing her audience. Dana asked if we had children. I said no, which made the room colder in a strange way. Without children, people have fewer excuses to keep a lie alive. Dana then asked about finances and property. I said we shared certain accounts and shared a lease. Dana asked whether either party had been moving money or hiding expenses. I said I had not. Elara said she had not. Dana scheduled a second session for the following week and asked us both to bring basic documentation of shared expenses and housing obligations. Then Dana asked us to agree on a limited contact plan until the next session. Elara wanted no contact. I asked for written-only contact for logistics. Dana wrote it down and made it part of the session summary. As we stood to leave, Dana asked one last thing. She asked Elara if she wanted Tessa involved in future sessions. Elara said yes. Dana said Tessa could attend only if both parties agreed, and she asked me if I agreed. I looked at Dana and said I did not, because Tessa was not a neutral support person and had been injecting herself into our narrative publicly. Dana wrote that down without expression. Elara's face hardened. She walked out of the office without looking at me. Dana walked us to the waiting room, where Tessa rose immediately, ready to reclaim the wheel. Tessa asked how it went. Elara said it was fine, but her voice shook. Tessa turned to me and said we should keep things respectful. I told her the mediator already wrote that into the record. Tessa's smile slipped for a fraction of a second, then returned. On the way out, my phone buzzed with a new message, and I saw Nolan's name on the screen. I did not open it immediately. I waited until I was in my car, door closed, engine off. Nolan's message was short and careful. He said he wanted to talk, man to man. He said he did not want conflict. He said Elara was under pressure and needed compassion. He said we could reach an understanding. An understanding. Men like Nolan always want understanding when their actions are about to become consequences. I did not reply. I took a screenshot of the message preview with the time visible and saved it. Then I opened my call log and stared at the blank line where Nolan's number sat, waiting to be used as a trap. If I called, he could twist the conversation. If I met him, he could create a scene. If I ignored him, he would escalate the narrative to fill the silence. So I made the only move that kept my hands clean. I forwarded Nolan's message to Dana's office email, with a neutral note stating that a third party involved in the dispute had contacted me directly, and I wanted the mediator aware for record clarity. I did not accuse. I did not editorialize. I simply made sure the approach existed outside my phone. That afternoon, Walter called. He did not ask how the mediation went. He asked whether I intended to embarrass Elara publicly. I told him I intended to use formal process and documented facts, and I intended to avoid conflict. Walter said the family would not tolerate scandal. I told him scandal is not created by documentation. It is created by behavior that cannot survive documentation. Walter went quiet. Then he said Elara was fragile. He said she needed support. I told him support is different from protection from consequences. Walter's voice tightened, and he warned me not to make enemies in the family. I thanked him for his concern and ended the call. That night, I added a new page to my ledger, not because I enjoyed it, but because this was now a war of record-keeping. I wrote the session date, the mediator's policy about support people, the RSVP evidence summary, the Tessa group message summary, and Nolan's contact attempt. I stapled my printed copies together and placed them in the folder. Then I sat in the dark and let myself feel the one emotion I had been refusing. The emotion was not rage. It was disgust. Not at Elara's desire for her ex, not at Nolan's smugness, but at the coordinated effort to turn my calmness into a crime. My phone buzzed again near midnight. It was a new message from Elara. She said the mediator session had been stressful, and she asked that I stop collecting things about her. She said it made her feel watched. She said it proved she had been right about me. I read it slowly, then typed a single response. I said I would not discuss emotional topics over text, and I said all logistical matters should go through the mediator's recommended channel. No argument, no defense. If she wanted to frame my documentation as stalking, then I would keep the documentation anchored to formal process. 10 minutes later, the message showed as read. Elara did not reply. The next morning, I woke with a strange clarity. Tessa's strategy depended on two things: controlling the room and controlling the record. Dana had already denied her the room. Now I would deny her the record. And to deny her the record, I needed to find what Elara had been coached to say before Elara said it again. The first sign came from a place so ordinary, it almost felt insulting. I was making coffee when I heard the printer in the hall click and whir. I had not printed anything. The shared wireless printer had been set up years ago, when Elara and I still believed convenience was harmless. The printer spat out a single page, then stopped. I walked over and lifted the page from the tray. It was a draft. Not a document meant for me, not a letter with my name, but a page of typed notes, formatted like bullet points for a conversation. The title at the top said nothing dramatic. It read, Talking Points. I stood there for a full minute, coffee cooling in my hand, and felt my stomach tighten in a slow, controlled way. The paper was not proof of an affair. It was proof of intent. It was the map of a narrative. The bullet points were chilling in their simplicity. They were phrases about emotional safety, about intimidation through silence, about feeling controlled, about needing a trusted friend present during interactions. There were lines about my tone being menacing, about my calmness being manipulative, about me collecting evidence as a form of surveillance. There was even a line advising her to insist on meeting only in public places, and a line reminding her to tell people she feared escalation. The language matched Elara's texts. The language matched her careful phrasing in the mediator session. The language matched the neighborhood posts and Tessa's group messages. This was not organic emotion. This was choreography. I did not touch the paper longer than necessary. I placed it on the table and photographed it beside that morning's newspaper, because dates matter more than outrage. Then I picked it up and flipped it over. On the back, in a different font, there was a short list of names. Tessa's name was there, Nolan's name was there, Walter's name was there, and under the names, one line that made my throat go dry. Keep him calm until the gala. The gala. I stared at the line as if it could blink away. The Trust's annual charity gala was scheduled in 2 weeks. It was the event where donors, sponsors, and family allies gathered in one room to perform Unity. It was also the perfect public arena for Tessa to freeze me out, elevate Nolan, and present Elara as a brave survivor. If she could keep me calm until then, she could position my inevitable response as a sudden explosion, the proof she needed to validate the narrative. I exhaled slowly and forced my hands to stay steady. Panic would make me sloppy, and sloppy would give her exactly what she wanted. I took the page, slid it into a clear sleeve, labeled it with date and time, and placed it in my folder. Then I sat down and wrote 2 lines in my ledger. Narrative script discovered via printer output. Target event identified, charity gala. I did not call anyone. I did not message Elara. I did not confront Tessa. Confrontations are for people who want closure. I wanted leverage. Later that day, Mara stopped by. I did not ask her to come for drama. I asked her to come because she had been the only person consistently honest, and I needed a second set of eyes that belonged to reality. I showed her the sleeve with the talking points. Mara read it once, then again, slower. She looked up at me with a face that held both anger and pity. Mara said Tessa had been circulating guidance to Elara's friends, telling them how to support Elara in case I reacted badly. Mara said she had refused to share it, but she had heard about it from someone else. Mara said Tessa had been pushing a specific idea, that I was the kind of man who would try to ruin Elara with evidence. Mara looked at the sleeve and said flatly that Tessa had written the script. I asked Mara one question. I asked whether she knew if the gala had any official program, seating plan, or public guest list preview. Mara said yes. She said the board secretary had posted a draft agenda in a committee channel, and some donors had received RSVP confirmations. Mara offered to send me whatever was public. I nodded and thanked her. Then I asked Mara to do one more thing, carefully. I asked her to confirm whether Nolan was attending as a sponsor guest and whether he had any formal role, like presenting a pledge or being introduced. Mara said she would check. After Mara left, I sat on the couch and forced myself to think like a man building a case, not a man nursing a wound. Tessa's strength was optics. My strength was structure. The gala was an optics machine. That meant my structure had to arrive there in a way that could not be ignored, but also could not be dismissed as emotional revenge. I needed a mechanism that created consequence without creating pity for Elara. My phone buzzed again that evening. Nolan called. I did not answer. I let it ring out. Then I took a screenshot of the missed call in my log with the time visible. Minutes later, he sent another message. He said he did not want to be the enemy. He said he wanted to find a way to keep things civil. He said Elara had been through enough. He wrote as if he were the protector. He wrote as if I were the threat. He wrote as if he had not been the one inserted into my marriage like a knife hidden inside a gift. I did not reply. Instead, I forwarded the second message to the mediator again, with the same neutral note. Third-party contact continues. Request this be noted for boundaries. The following morning, my landlord emailed about the lease renewal, asking whether both tenants intended to stay. The timing was almost too neat. Housing pressure is another lever Tessa could use. If Elara could claim she could not safely return, she could frame me as the reason the lease changed. If I could show the lease issue was practical and shared, then her victim framing became less believable. I replied to the landlord with a simple statement that we were in mediation and would update soon. Then I printed the email header and filed it. Not because I thought the landlord mattered, but because every documented, calm step made my timeline stronger. That afternoon, Dana's office sent the session summary and the next appointment confirmation. I printed it and signed the back. Then I read it again, with the kind of focus that feels clinical. Dana had written that both parties agreed to written-only communication for logistics. Dana had written that support people were not present. Dana had written that evidence had been referenced and that future sessions would address finances and housing. It was not explosive. It was not dramatic. It was exactly what I needed. A neutral professional record that did not belong to me. 2 days later, Mara sent me the first useful gala item, a screenshot of the draft seating plan for the sponsor table area. It was not final, but it showed the intention. Nolan's name was placed near Elara's, and Tessa's was placed on the other side, like a brace. My name was not on that table. My name was listed in a general family section farther back. They had already decided I would be background noise at my own family's event. They had already decided Elara and Nolan would appear aligned, and they had already decided Tessa would play handler. This was not an affair. This was a rebranding. I printed the seating plan screenshot and slipped it into a sleeve. Then I wrote one line under it in my ledger. Planned public pairing. Elara and Nolan seated together by design. That night, I did something I had not done in weeks. I opened the shared cloud album again, not to stalk, but to verify patterns. I scrolled through old event photos and stopped at the one memory pop-up that had rattled me before. I zoomed in on the corner where Nolan stood near Elara. I did not zoom for scandal. I zoomed for context. The image was dated a full year earlier, at a community event Walter had hosted. Nolan's hand placement, Elara's posture, their proximity, it all suggested familiarity that could not be blamed on a new friendship. I saved the metadata view that showed the date, then printed it. It was not enough to prove everything, but it was enough to prove one thing. The connection predated the current story of sudden fear and sudden stress. That was the late twist, fully formed now. This was not a recent rupture caused by my behavior. This was a long-running arrangement disguised as normalcy, now being converted into a public narrative where I was the obstacle. The difference mattered because it stripped Elara of the most useful excuse, that she acted impulsively under pressure. She did not act impulsively. She acted with rehearsal. The next day, I received an envelope in the mail addressed to Elara at our apartment. The return address belonged to a small local advocacy group, one of those places that provides resources and templates for people navigating difficult relationships. I did not open it. I did not need to. The envelope itself was a signal. Someone was feeding her the language of process without committing to actual legal action. Someone was handing her vocabulary designed to make her unchallengeable. I photographed the unopened envelope beside the date stamp on the mail. Then I placed it in a sleeve and labeled it. Resource framing mail arrives after mediator boundary set. That evening, Elara sent a message requesting to pick up the remainder of her things. She asked to come the next day and said she wanted Tessa present. I replied that she could come at a set time, and Mara could be present again as a neutral witness. I added calmly that the apartment was still her legal residence under the lease, and she was welcome to retrieve items, but we would keep it orderly. Elara responded with a single line that made my skin tighten. She said she hoped I would not punish her for leaving. Punish her. The script again. I replied that I had no interest in punishment, only process. Then I stopped typing. When Elara arrived the next day, she came alone. Tessa was not visible. That absence told me two things. Either Tessa had finally realized she was too obvious, or Tessa had realized that being absent could also create a narrative. Elara's face was pale, and her movements were sharp, like she was trying to move fast enough to outrun her own guilt. Mara was present again, sitting quietly at the table. Elara gathered items with the same careful speed, avoiding the drawer, avoiding my eyes. At one point, she opened a kitchen cabinet and reached for a stack of folders. She froze when she saw my folder of sleeves on the table, then reached for a different item instead. She was afraid of the paper. Not because paper hurts, because paper cannot be gaslit. As Elara carried a final box toward the door, a thin notebook slipped out and fell to the floor. It was small, a planner-style notebook with a soft cover. Elara reacted too quickly, bending to snatch it before anyone could see. The movement was reflex, protective, and it screamed that the notebook mattered. Mara saw it too. Mara said calmly that if it was important, Elara should not drop it. Elara glared at Mara, then forced a smile that looked painful. She said it was nothing. She tucked it into her bag and hurried out. The door closed. The apartment fell silent again. Mara looked at me and said quietly that Elara was terrified. I nodded once. I said she was not terrified of me. She was terrified of losing control of the story. That night, my phone buzzed with a new email from the gala committee. It was sent to a distribution list that included me and several family members. It was a brief message about final confirmations and sponsor acknowledgements. There was a line about special thanks to Nolan for supporting the trust this year, and beneath that, a note that the board chair, Tessa, would be recognized for leadership and community impact. Board chair. Mara had told me Tessa was influential, but this confirmed the formal title. Tessa was not a helpful friend. Tessa was the person controlling the stage. I stared at the email header and felt the last pieces click into place. The gala was not just a social event. It was a controlled arena, run by the same person writing the script. If I walked into that room unprepared, I would become the villain in her story by design. But if I walked into that room with the right proof delivered the right way, I could flip the room against her without raising my voice. I printed the email and placed it in my folder. Then I pulled out the sleeve containing the talking points page and read the line again. Keep him calm until the gala. I sat back and smiled once, without warmth, without joy. Because the part they misunderstood was simple. I was calm because calm is a choice, and choices can change. The only question left was which part of their script I would break first. The week before, the gala moved like damp weather, slow and heavy, pressing into every corner of the day. Elara stopped messaging unless she needed something practical, and even then she wrote as if an attorney was reading over her shoulder. I did not respond with emotion, because emotion was the fuel they wanted to pour on the floor. I responded with clean, short lines and dates. If she wanted a story about fear, she would not get it from my hands. The talking points page stayed in its sleeve inside my folder, the way you keep a venomous thing contained until you need to show someone it exists. The list of names on the back did not leave my mind. Elara, Nolan, Walter, and Tessa arranged like a plan. It was not a love triangle, not the messy kind. It was a committee. Dana's office confirmed our next session. I attended alone, on time, with my ledger, and the same expression I used when I had to listen to a man explain why a mistake was actually a choice. Elara arrived with a new posture, one that tried to look fragile without looking weak. She asked again for Tessa to be present, and Dana shut it down again. Dana did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She had policy and routine on her side, and routine is the enemy of manipulation. Dana asked us to address housing and shared expenses. I handed over a one-page list of obligations and the simplest proposal possible. Shared bills separated cleanly, lease handled with the landlord, and communication limited to written logistics. Elara tried to pivot toward feelings, describing how my calmness made her uneasy. Dana did not take the bait. Dana asked for specifics. Elara could not produce them without inventing something, and she was not brave enough to invent it in front of someone who wrote notes for a living. When Dana asked whether third parties were contacting either of us, I said Nolan had attempted direct contact twice, and I had forwarded the messages to the mediator for record clarity. Dana looked at Elara and asked if she had asked Nolan to contact me. Elara said she had not, and she sounded like she believed that lie could still work in a room with paper. Dana nodded, then stated a boundary in plain language. No third-party contact, no indirect messaging, and no public statements designed to influence the process. Dana said that if either party violated the boundary, it would be documented and used to shape future recommendations. Elara's eyes tightened at the word documented, the same way they did at the dinner table when I placed truth into the silence. People like Elara and Tessa did not fear consequences. They feared records. After the session, I drove to the leasing office and requested a meeting about the renewal. I did not complain about Elara. I did not describe the marriage. I kept it clean. 2 tenants, shared lease, separation in progress, clarification needed. The leasing agent printed a brief summary of our current terms and noted that any removal of a tenant would require written agreement or formal documentation. I asked for a stamped copy of the printout. She gave it to me without drama. I photographed it beside my car clock in the parking lot and added it to the folder. The pressure came from the family next. Walter called twice in 3 days, each call shorter than the last, like he was trying to find the right angle to make me feel responsible for his discomfort. He did not say he wanted me to forgive Elara. He said he wanted peace at the gala. He said he wanted the family to look united. He said donors were watching and community standing mattered. I told him the same thing each time, and I told it without heat. I said, unity built on lies is not unity. I said the gala was not my project to manage. I said I would not create a scene, but I would not protect a narrative designed to stain me. Walter went quiet, and I could hear him recalculating. He had expected rage or begging. He got a man who sounded like he already signed the paper in his head. Mara continued to send me what she could, careful and lawful. She confirmed Nolan was not just attending. He had been scheduled to be recognized for a major pledge, a public thank you planned as part of the program. She also confirmed something else, and it was the first true crack in the structure. Mara told me the pledge had conditions. It was not a donation out of kindness. It was a sponsorship tied to a vendor arrangement. Nolan's company was providing services to the trust, and the pledge was being used to justify the contract. Tessa had pushed it through quickly, describing it as community partnership, and nobody wanted to look suspicious by asking too many questions. That meant the gala was not just a stage, it was a proof point. The public praise was part of the transaction. That was the mid-story twist, clean and ugly. Nolan was not just an ex with lingering feelings. Nolan was a lever in Tessa's machine. If the contract fell, the praise fell, and if the praise fell, their entire rebranding project lost its shine. I did not need to destroy their lives. I only needed to remove the scaffolding they were standing on. The husband in their script was supposed to be emotional and reactive. The husband they had was someone who could read a structure and identify the joints. I booked a short meeting with the Trust's event coordinator using a public contact email. I did not frame it as conflict. I framed it as a logistics clarification, because that is what professionals respond to. I asked politely who the point person was for seating adjustments and donor acknowledgments. The coordinator replied with a name and a phone number, and I saved the email header, printed it, and filed it. Then I did something that felt small, but mattered. I wrote a single clean page titled Evidence Ledger Summary, and I kept it as dry as a receipt. Date of the trip return. Time of Elara's message claiming she was in our bed. Time of her arrival 20 minutes later panicking. Date of the RSVP screenshot showing Nolan tied to the trust event. Date of the talking points page discovered via printer output. Date of Nolan's direct contact attempts. Date of the gala committee email praising Nolan. Every line had a timestamp, a source, and a note on how it was obtained lawfully. No accusations, no adjectives, just wait. I printed 10 copies, not because I planned to hand them to strangers like a pamphlet, but because in a room full of people trained to believe the smoothest voice, a neat page of dates is the only thing that can speak louder than charm. 2 nights before the gala, Elara sent me a message that finally sounded like her own fear, not the scripted version. She asked if I planned to embarrass her. She said she was already stressed. She said she could not handle public shame. She said she wanted things handled quietly. I stared at the message for a long time. If she had asked for truth months earlier, we would not be here. Now she was asking for silence, because silence protected the lie. I did not answer with cruelty. I answered with the only line that mattered. I told her I planned to handle things with process and documentation, and I planned to avoid drama. I told her that if she wanted quiet, she should stop building a public story where I was the villain. She read it. She did not reply. The next morning, I received another email from the gala committee, a reminder about arrival times, and a note that the board chair would open the evening with a short address. Tessa was not hiding her ownership of the room. She wanted that microphone. She wanted the first narrative of the night to be hers. I packed my folder that afternoon. Then I created one more item, a set of sealed envelopes, each containing the evidence ledger summary and one supporting sleeve copy. One envelope was for the board secretary. One was for the event coordinator. One was for Dana, as a record of third-party interference if it became necessary. I wrote each name in plain ink. No drama, no bold red marker, just seriousness. That evening I called Mara and asked one question. I asked who the board secretary was and whether she would be present. Mara gave me the name, and she said yes, the secretary always handled minutes and donor acknowledgments. Mara hesitated, then added that the secretary was careful and disliked scandal. That was good. People who dislike scandal tend to respect documentation because it gives them a way to act without feeling like they are choosing sides. The night before the gala, I slept in a full 8 hours, and it felt like a weapon. I woke before my alarm and sat at my kitchen table with coffee, not because I needed caffeine, but because I needed to feel normal while my mind stayed sharp. I read through the ledger once more, then I placed the sealed envelopes and the clear sleeves into the folder, each item aligned like a plan. I left early and I drove to the venue without rushing, because rushing makes your hands betray you. The ballroom sat inside a hotel, the kind with a bright lobby and too many reflective surfaces, designed to make people feel visible and important. That lobby was the first battlefield. The gala did not start inside the ballroom. It started in the way people greeted each other, the way they positioned their bodies, and the way they decided who belonged. When I walked in, the doorman nodded politely, and I recognized him from earlier days when Elara and I still attended family functions as a unit. His eyes flicked over me, then away, like he was trying not to be involved. I could smell the rumor trail already, the quiet, sticky kind that spreads without anyone admitting they started it. I found the event coordinator near the registration table. She wore a headset and the strained smile of someone holding 100 moving parts together. I approached with the calm of a man asking about seating, not the desperation of a man asking for justice. I introduced myself and said I wanted to confirm my seating assignment and clarify something about acknowledgments, because I had received the committee email and noticed inconsistencies. The coordinator asked what inconsistencies. I did not answer with accusation. I handed her a sealed envelope and said it contained a 1-page ledger summary, and I asked her to keep it for the record and route it to the board secretary before the program began. I told her it related to donor acknowledgments and public representation. I did not say affair. I did not say betrayal. I kept it in the language of the arena. The coordinator's smile thinned. She looked at the envelope as if it might be explosive. I told her it was not a threat, and it was not a speech. I told her it was documentation, and it would help prevent confusion later. She hesitated, then nodded and said she would pass it along. She was grateful, I could tell, because I had given her a procedural reason to act. People like her do not want drama. They want a reason to make a decision without being blamed. Then I found the board secretary. She stood near the edge of the ballroom entrance, holding a tablet and scanning the room like someone trained to count chairs and risks. She was mid-40s, controlled, dressed in a way that suggested she had learned to look invisible to power so she could survive it. I approached slowly, introduced myself, and handed her the second sealed envelope. I told her quietly that it contained documentation relevant to tonight's acknowledgments and potential conflicts, and that I wanted it entered into the meeting minutes as evidence received if a dispute arose. The secretary blinked. She did not ask what it was. She asked one question that mattered. She asked whether it was lawful. I told her it was household level, publicly sourced, and directly relevant. I told her it included no private access and no surveillance. I told her it was dates, headers, and printed screenshots. I watched her eyes shift at the words dates and headers, because she understood what that meant. Dates and headers are the skeleton of truth. She nodded once and said she would review it before the board chair spoke. She did not smile. She did not promise to help. She accepted the envelope the way a court clerk accepts a filing, without emotion, because emotion can be used against you. I took my seat in the family section, far enough back that I could see the whole room. The sponsor table in the front looked like a perfect triangle. Elara's chair, Nolan's chair, Tessa's chair, arranged like a statement. Elara arrived with the expression of a woman performing calm. Nolan arrived smiling like a man who believed the room belonged to him. Tessa arrived last, because power always arrives last when it wants people to feel grateful it showed up. I watched them greet donors and board members, and I watched how quickly people adjusted their posture around Tessa. People did not love her. They feared being excluded by her. That fear was her true currency. Elara glanced toward the back once, found me, then looked away as if eye contact would count as confession. Nolan did not look away. Nolan looked directly at me, then turned back to a donor and laughed. His confidence was designed to provoke. He wanted me to react. He wanted to be able to tell the room later that I had been unstable. I did not move. The lights dimmed. The music softened. The event coordinator tapped her headset and began moving like a conductor. Tessa rose to open the program. She took the microphone with a practiced smile and the calm authority of someone who believed she controlled the narrative. She spoke about community, trust, family, and resilience. She used words designed to make the room feel warm. Then she used a different tone, subtle, like a knife hidden inside a hug. She spoke about supporting people through difficult transitions. She spoke about the importance of believing someone when they say they feel unsafe. I felt the room shift, almost imperceptibly, as donors and relatives filled in the blanks. This was the first move of her plan. She was laying the emotional foundation so any documentation would look like cruelty. She was trying to pre-frame my proof as punishment. Then the board secretary stood and walked to the side of the stage, tablet in hand, and leaned toward the event coordinator. The coordinator's face changed, not dramatically, just enough. Tessa continued speaking, but I saw a tightness appear at the corner of her mouth. She had been given a signal she did not like. The coordinator stepped onto the stage after Tessa's opening and announced the first sponsor acknowledgement. She thanked several donors, then paused before Nolan's name. The pause was small, but in a room like that, pauses are loud. The coordinator glanced toward the board secretary, then continued in a revised tone, stating that acknowledgements were being adjusted pending an internal review of conflict of interest disclosures. Conflict of interest. The phrase landed like cold water. Tessa's smile froze for half a second. Nolan's posture stiffened. Elara's face went pale. The coordinator moved on quickly, trying to keep the room smooth, but the room was already awake now. Wealthy rooms are polite, not blind. They notice discomfort because discomfort threatens their illusion of safety. Tessa stood again, too quickly, and requested a brief recess for clarification. Her voice remained sweet, but her body moved with urgency. She stepped off stage and walked toward the board secretary with the controlled stride of someone who expected obedience. Nolan followed, and Elara rose as if pulled by a string. I did not rush forward. I waited. I let them walk into the consequence they had tried to build for me. Near the side of the ballroom, the board secretary opened the envelope and held up the one-page ledger summary, showing Tessa the dates like a mirror. The secretary spoke quietly, but her tone was firm. Tessa's face sharpened. Nolan leaned in, and I saw him try to smile it away, as if charm could erase timestamps. Then Elara did something small that mattered more than shouting. She reached for the page as if she wanted to take it back. The secretary stepped slightly away, maintaining possession. Elara's eyes filled, not with heartbreak, but with panic. Tessa tried to redirect. She gestured toward me, toward the back of the room, as if she wanted to make me the issue. The secretary looked past her and asked, clearly, whether these documents were false. The question was procedural, not emotional. It was the kind of question that forces a liar to pick a lane. Nolan said they were misunderstandings. Tessa said they were private matters. Elara said nothing. The secretary asked if Nolan had contacted me directly despite mediator boundaries. She had read the forwarded message headers. Nolan hesitated, then tried to reframe, claiming he had reached out for peace. The secretary did not argue. She simply noted that direct contact during an active mediation process created risk for the charity because it suggested intentional interference. Then the secretary asked for one more thing. She asked whether Tessa had circulated guidance instructing Elara to keep me calm until the gala. The secretary held up the sleeve containing the talking points page. The words hit Tessa like a slap. She did not flinch outwardly, but her eyes flashed in a way that exposed the anger beneath her control. She tried to claim it was supportive advice. The secretary asked why supportive advice included a plan to manage a spouse's behavior for a public event. Tessa's mouth opened, then shut. I watched from my seat, still and silent, because the most brutal part of truth is that it does not require you to raise your voice. It requires you to let the right person read the right sentence. The board secretary walked back to the stage and spoke to the event coordinator again. The coordinator nodded, then stepped to the microphone and announced a short pause for an internal board matter, requesting donors remain seated. In a room like that, requesting people remain seated is a way of admitting the room is about to witness something real. Tessa's eyes scanned the ballroom, trying to measure the damage. Then she turned and walked directly toward me. Nolan and Elara followed. The three of them crossed the floor like a small storm headed toward the back, and the room watched because human beings cannot look away from a power structure cracking. When they reached my row, Tessa stopped in front of me and tried to speak with a smile that did not reach her eyes. She asked me to step outside and discuss privately, insisting we should keep this contained. Nolan nodded, as if we were equals negotiating. Elara stood slightly behind them, shoulders tight, face strained. I stayed seated. I told Tessa, quietly and clearly, that I would not discuss anything privately at the gala. I told her that if there was a board concern, it should be handled by the board. I told her that if she believed my documentation was false, she was welcome to state that on record. Tessa's face tightened. She wanted a hallway. She wanted a corner. She wanted the kind of privacy where she could rewrite the story later. I refused to give her privacy. The event coordinator's voice came over the microphone again, asking all board members to assemble near the stage for a brief procedural vote, and asking the board secretary to read a conflict of interest disclosure line into the record. Tessa froze. Nolan looked suddenly younger, less certain. Elara's eyes darted toward the exit, like an animal looking for a gap. That was the moment I knew the trap had failed. They had planned to keep me calm until the gala, then provoke me into looking dangerous. Instead, I had kept calm and handed the room a file it could not ignore. They turned away from me and moved toward the stage, forced now by the machine they built. The donors watched. Family members leaned forward. People whispered without covering their mouths, because once a room senses blood, politeness becomes optional. I remained seated until the board members were in place. Then I stood and walked toward the side of the stage, not to speak, but to be present. My role was not to perform. My role was to exist as the quiet anchor of documentation. The board secretary spoke into the microphone with the voice of someone reading minutes, not gossip. She stated that an evidence packet had been received alleging a conflict of interest pattern involving sponsor acknowledgement, vendor relationships, and third-party interference in a private mediation process. She stated that the board would vote to temporarily suspend acknowledgements tied to the alleged conflict until review. She stated that if the conflict involved the board chair, a temporary chair would be assigned for the vote. Tessa tried to object. The secretary did not allow it to become a speech. She asked in front of the room whether Tessa had circulated talking points instructing Elara to keep me calm until the gala. She held up the clear sleeve so the text could be seen by those close enough. Tessa said it was taken out of context. The secretary asked whether it was her document. Tessa did not answer immediately, and that delay was the answer. In a room like that, silence is an admission when a document is visible. The secretary then asked whether Nolan had a vendor contract connected to his pledge. Nolan tried to speak, and a board member, an older woman with an unimpressed face, asked him to stop and let the board handle it. Nolan stepped back, and his smile finally died. The room had crossed the threshold. This was not drama anymore. This was process. The vote began, and the secretary typed notes as names were called. Tessa's hands clenched at her sides. Elara stood near the sponsor table, breathing shallowly, like she could not decide whether to defend or disappear. Nolan stared at the floor, then at the exit, calculating. The board voted to suspend Nolan's public acknowledgement pending review. The board voted to place the vendor partnership on hold pending a conflict of interest check. Then, with the same procedural tone, they voted to assign a temporary chair for the remainder of the meeting. Tessa lost her microphone in front of the room, and she did not know how to breathe without it. She turned toward me with a look that was no longer friendly, no longer controlled, but raw and furious. She wanted to blame me for the collapse. She wanted to make me the villain one last time. I met her eyes and gave her the calm truth she feared most. I told her she was not losing control because I attacked her. I told her she was losing control because she wrote her intentions down and sent them to a printer. The room went quiet again, the same kind of dead silence from the family dinner, but heavier now because it was not just relatives listening. It was donors, board members, and staff, all watching a power structure crack in public. Elara's face crumpled, and she took one step backward, as if she had just realized she had been standing on someone else's plan. Nolan tried to speak again, and the event coordinator, voice steady, asked him to step aside until the review was complete. A security staff member approached, calm and polite, and asked Nolan to move away from the stage. Nolan complied, because there is nothing a confident man hates more than being escorted without drama. Tessa stood frozen for a second, then looked at Walter in the front row as if demanding rescue. Walter did not move. Walter's face looked older, and the anger in his eyes was directed at the wrong person, which meant it was directed at himself. I watched Elara, because she was the reason this began. Elara's eyes met mine, and for a moment I saw something genuine in them. Recognition that she had tried to poison my name, and now had to live in the room where the poison spilled onto her own hands. I did not step toward her. I did not comfort her. Comfort would have been permission. I simply turned slightly and gave the board secretary a nod, the kind you give a person who has done their job without letting the room become a circus. Then, the board secretary spoke again, stating that evidence had been received and the review would proceed, and the evening's program would continue with a revised agenda. The gala attempted to restart, but the air had changed. People sat differently. Conversations shifted. Donors who had once been friendly to Tessa now avoided her. Elara sat at her table like a statue someone forgot to move. Nolan was no longer the star. He was a question. And Tessa, the architect, stood without a stage, watching the room turn its back. That was not the final consequence yet. That was the door opening. The final consequence would be when Elara realized she could not go back to a story where she was protected, because the protection had been the lie. The coordinator cranked jazz and dimmed lights to salvage the gala, but no volume could drown the rupture. The wealthy room functioned on autopilot, yet the social temperature plummeted. Allies drifted from Tessa, not from judgment, but self-preservation. No one risked ties to a scandal now in the minutes. I needed no speech. I had moved private pain into public record, beyond her control. That was revenge's cleanest form, denying the arena for harm. Elara sat rigid, eyes scanning for escape like a cliff's edge in darkness. Walter urged me to stop. The family would handle it. I replied they had, disastrously. I documented patterns, not points, and placed them where rules applied equally. Nolan's charm evaporated. Donors sensed risk and withdrew. Tessa watched officials, dreading formalization more than divorce. I delivered final evidence to the secretary. Documents spoke for me. Elara approached, breaking. She admitted lies. Nolan coached fear. She rejected Tessa's control, refusing to move when ordered away. The secretary noted her statement. Tapping keys echoed louder than shouts. A board member silenced Tessa's interference. Power collapsed quietly when permission withdrew. Elara left with controlled dignity, the night's sole respectable act. Nolan vanished unacknowledged. Tessa stood isolated, structurally finished. I confirmed receipt in the minutes, met Tessa's glare without guilt, and walked into cold air. Breathing eased. The story was no longer theirs. Elara lost me not through cruelty, but by weaponizing silence as violence, and the record refused.